In this episode, we're going to connect strategic planning to governance in a way that feels like a daily leadership capability rather than an annual document, because beginners often picture planning as something that happens once a year and then sits on a shelf while real work takes over. When strategic planning is embedded into governance, the enterprise uses planning as a repeating discipline that keeps IT direction aligned to business goals, constraints, and changing conditions. Without that embedded planning, IT direction tends to drift, not because anyone is careless, but because decisions are made under pressure, new requests arrive, and priorities change informally without a consistent process for recentering. Drift is dangerous because it looks like progress, but it is progress in scattered directions, leading to duplicated systems, wasted spending, and risks that accumulate silently. Building planning into governance means the enterprise has a structured way to decide what matters most, what gets funded, what gets deferred, and how progress is monitored so alignment stays real over time. By the end, you should be able to explain how governance turns planning into an operating rhythm, how planning decisions translate into priorities and investment choices, and how leaders prevent IT from wandering away from enterprise mission. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGEIT.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to define strategic planning in governance terms, because planning here is not just brainstorming and it is not just creating a list of projects. Strategic planning is the disciplined process of translating enterprise direction into a set of objectives, priorities, and resource commitments that guide decisions over time. In the context of enterprise IT governance, planning includes deciding which capabilities the enterprise needs, which risks must be managed, and what outcomes must be achieved through technology and information. Planning also includes acknowledging constraints such as budget, staffing, regulatory obligations, and legacy system realities, so priorities are realistic. When planning is done well, it creates a shared reference point that leaders can use when conflicts arise, such as when two departments want competing initiatives funded. Governance uses that reference point to make decisions consistent and defensible, rather than allowing ad hoc choices to dominate. Beginners sometimes think planning is about predicting the future perfectly, but governance planning is about creating a direction and a decision framework that can adapt when the future changes. The point is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to reduce chaos by making priorities explicit. When you understand planning this way, it becomes clear why it must be built into governance rather than treated as a separate activity. Strategic planning is necessary in governance because IT direction is shaped by hundreds of small decisions that add up, and without a consistent plan, those decisions often pull in different directions. Even well-intentioned leaders can unintentionally create drift by approving exceptions, funding urgent requests, and reacting to incidents without rechecking alignment to mission. Planning embedded in governance prevents drift by providing a clear set of strategic objectives that can be used as criteria for prioritization and investment decisions. It also provides a way to review whether the current portfolio of work still matches the enterprise's direction, because alignment is not a one-time achievement. It is an ongoing condition that must be maintained. Another reason planning matters is that many IT investments have long life cycles, meaning decisions made today can shape constraints for years. Without planning discipline, organizations often accumulate complexity that later slows them down, making future strategy harder to execute. Planning also allows leaders to balance short-term needs and long-term capability building, which is a classic governance trade-off. Beginners sometimes focus on immediate visible work, but governance must manage the invisible long-term effects of technology direction. Embedded planning is how leaders keep the enterprise on mission while still responding to real-world demands. To embed planning into governance, the enterprise must first treat planning as part of decision-making, not as a separate report that only planners read. That means planning outputs should directly influence funding approvals, project prioritization, architecture direction, and risk management choices. If planning is disconnected from these decisions, it becomes ceremonial and people stop trusting it. Governance accomplishes this by using planning objectives as decision criteria and by requiring that major investments and initiatives demonstrate alignment with strategic goals before they are approved. It also means that when priorities shift, the shift is handled through a governance process rather than through informal conversations, so the enterprise can see the trade-offs and the consequences. Embedding planning also requires that planning is not confined to IT teams. Business leadership must be involved because strategic objectives and value outcomes are business-owned. Governance provides the forum where business and IT can jointly define what technology direction should support and how success will be measured. For beginners, a useful mental image is that planning becomes the map, and governance is the steering mechanism that uses the map continuously, not only at the start of a trip. When steering follows the map, direction stays coherent. When steering ignores it, drift becomes inevitable. Operating rhythm is a critical part of embedding planning, because planning must be revisited regularly to remain relevant. A common beginner mistake is to assume strategic planning is annual, while governance oversight is monthly, but effective governance blends horizons so planning is refreshed at the cadence the enterprise needs. That does not mean rewriting strategy constantly. It means periodically reviewing objectives, priorities, and constraints to ensure decisions remain aligned to mission. For example, governance might use a regular cadence to review the current portfolio, assess progress toward outcomes, and adjust priorities when conditions change. This rhythm also includes checking for drift signals, such as projects that no longer map to strategic objectives, growing numbers of exceptions, or investments that are consuming resources without producing benefits. The planning rhythm must also align with budgeting cycles, because funding is one of the strongest governance levers. When planning and budgeting are synchronized, funding decisions reinforce strategic direction rather than undermining it. Beginners should recognize that rhythm is how planning stays alive, because without rhythm, planning becomes stale and ignored. A governance framework that includes planning checkpoints is therefore more resilient under change and pressure. Another key aspect is translating high-level enterprise strategy into technology-relevant objectives, because governance must bridge the gap between business language and IT capabilities. If business strategy emphasizes customer experience, planning must translate that into objectives around service reliability, data quality, and responsiveness that technology can support. If business strategy emphasizes cost efficiency, planning must translate that into objectives around standardization, automation, and reducing redundant systems. If strategy emphasizes innovation, planning must translate that into objectives around delivery speed, platform reuse, and safe experimentation within risk guardrails. If strategy emphasizes trust and compliance, planning must translate that into objectives around control effectiveness, evidence readiness, and resilient operations. This translation is not purely technical. It is about defining outcomes that leaders can measure and that guide investment choices. Governance ensures the translation is shared and agreed, so IT teams do not chase goals that business leaders did not prioritize. For beginners, the lesson is that strategic planning is not abstract. It becomes practical when it produces objectives that influence what gets built, what gets maintained, and what gets retired. This is why planning is a governance topic and a certification topic. Prioritization is where planning becomes real, because planning without prioritization is just a wish list. Governance-driven planning requires that the enterprise selects a manageable set of priorities that reflect strategy and constraints, and then allocates resources accordingly. Prioritization must also consider risk and dependencies, because some work is prerequisite for other work, and some work reduces risks that could derail everything. Governance forums typically use defined criteria to prioritize, such as strategic alignment, expected value, risk reduction, compliance urgency, and resource availability. The important beginner concept is that prioritization is not simply picking what sounds best. It is selecting what the enterprise can realistically execute while still meeting obligations and managing risk. When prioritization is weak, organizations start too many initiatives, stretch teams thin, and deliver little value, which looks like IT failure, but is really a governance failure. Strategic planning embedded in governance prevents this by forcing trade-offs to be explicit and by limiting work to what can be executed responsibly. On the exam, when a scenario describes too many projects, unclear priorities, or constant shifting, a governance planning response that strengthens prioritization discipline is often the right move. Portfolio thinking is another governance planning concept that beginners often need to hear because the enterprise does not make decisions one project at a time in isolation. A portfolio is the collection of investments and initiatives the enterprise is funding and executing, and governance must manage the portfolio as a whole to ensure it aligns to strategy and fits resource constraints. Portfolio thinking helps leaders see duplication, identify gaps, and balance short-term and long-term work. It also helps leaders understand cumulative risk, because many small risks can add up to major exposure when combined. Governance uses portfolio oversight to ensure that the portfolio remains coherent, such as ensuring that investments support shared platforms rather than creating isolated solutions that increase complexity. Portfolio oversight also supports strategic planning because it provides feedback about what the enterprise is actually doing, not just what it intends. Beginners sometimes assume planning is forward-looking only, but governance planning is both forward-looking and reflective. It looks ahead to set priorities and looks back to assess whether investments delivered value. When the portfolio is reviewed regularly, drift is detected earlier, and leaders can reallocate resources before wasted effort grows. In scenario questions about misalignment and duplication, portfolio governance often provides the mechanism to restore direction. Another essential ingredient is integrating risk and compliance into planning, because planning that ignores risk creates fragile strategies that collapse under pressure. Governance planning should include understanding which risks could derail strategic objectives and which compliance obligations impose deadlines and evidence requirements. This does not mean planning becomes fear-based. It means planning is responsible and realistic. For example, if the enterprise depends on a critical system that is aging and unstable, planning must address resilience and modernization as strategic necessities, not as optional technical improvements. If external requirements impose incident reporting obligations, planning must ensure readiness and monitoring are prioritized, not deferred. Integrating risk into planning also helps leaders decide where to accept risk and where to invest in mitigation, aligning those choices to enterprise risk tolerance. Beginners sometimes think risk management is separate from planning, but governance views them as connected because strategy cannot be executed if risk events repeatedly disrupt operations. Planning embedded in governance ensures risk and compliance considerations influence priorities and funding decisions rather than appearing as after-the-fact fixes. The exam often rewards answers that integrate risk into strategic planning rather than treating it as an operational detail. Communication is also part of embedding planning into governance, because alignment fails when stakeholders do not understand priorities or the rationale behind them. Governance planning must be communicated in a way that helps teams make local decisions that support the plan. If teams do not know what the enterprise is prioritizing, they will prioritize based on local pressures, which produces drift even if the plan exists. Clear communication includes explaining what outcomes matter, how trade-offs were made, and how exceptions and changes to priorities will be handled. Communication also supports trust, because stakeholders are more likely to accept a decision they dislike if they understand the criteria and constraints that drove it. Governance planning communication should also include how progress will be monitored, because transparency helps prevent surprise and reduces political conflict. Beginners sometimes assume communication is soft, but in governance, it is a control mechanism that keeps distributed teams aligned. When communication is weak, the enterprise loses the benefits of planning because people cannot use the plan to guide behavior. In exam scenarios where teams appear misaligned or confused, strengthening planning communication and decision clarity is often part of the solution. Adaptability is the final piece to emphasize, because strategic planning embedded in governance must be able to respond to change without losing coherence. Enterprises face changes like new regulations, new competitors, new threats, and shifts in customer expectations, and governance planning must have a disciplined way to adjust priorities. Adaptability does not mean constantly changing the plan. It means having clear triggers and review points for when a change is significant enough to require revisiting priorities and resource allocations. Governance provides the legitimate forum for these adjustments, so shifts are transparent and managed rather than chaotic and political. A mature planning process also distinguishes between temporary interruptions and genuine strategic shifts, so the enterprise does not overreact to every short-term event. Beginners often worry that planning is pointless because the world changes, but governance planning is valuable precisely because it provides a structured way to respond to change. Without it, change produces panic and improvisation. With it, change produces deliberate adjustments and maintained alignment. On the exam, when scenarios describe new external pressures or unexpected events, answers that include reviewing and adjusting the plan through governance are often the most realistic and governance-aligned. To close, building strategic planning into governance so IT direction stays on mission means turning planning into a repeating leadership discipline that guides real decisions about priorities, funding, risk, and accountability. Governance embeds planning by using strategic objectives as decision criteria, synchronizing planning with budgeting and portfolio oversight, and establishing an operating rhythm that detects drift and enables adjustments. It translates enterprise strategy into measurable IT-enabled outcomes, ensures prioritization is realistic under constraints, and integrates risk and compliance as essential planning inputs rather than afterthoughts. It also communicates priorities clearly so distributed teams make local choices that support enterprise direction, and it preserves adaptability through disciplined review and escalation paths. When planning is embedded this way, IT direction becomes coherent over time, and the enterprise spends less energy reacting to chaos and more energy delivering value within acceptable risk. In the next episode, we will build on this planning foundation by ensuring that business cases and benefit realization exist before funding decisions, because planning only stays credible when investments are justified and outcomes are tracked after delivery.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.